Hello and welcome to another episode of the Symphonic podcast. My name is Bernardo Miethe, and with me as always is...
My name is Andrew Owen.
Alright, and Happy New Year everybody. It's 2015. It's been a while since we've done an episode, but it was mainly because Andrew was traveling or I was traveling. It's all about the holidays, you know how it is.
Yay, yay.
Yep. So we arrive at one of my favorite composers. We're going to talk about Mahler today, and for those of you that have been with us since the first episode, you might have noticed that the introduction to this very podcast is always the final movement of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, and that's a very jubilant piece, as you've heard in this podcast, and that's why I chose it. And also because I love Mahler, of course, and Mahler's considered one of the ultra romantics, right? With Bruckner as well, and trying to expand the romantic ideas to the nth degree, right, Andrew?
Oh yeah. I mean, a lot of people say that when he died, Romanticism died with him. I mean, he was sort of the last, or like the Johann Sebastian Bach is to Baroque, he is to the Romantic era.
Yeah.
Still just getting bigger and bigger. Strauss lives on and does his own thing, and he lives to like 1948. Mm-hmm. He outlives himself, I think he says. But Mahler, I mean, he dies pretty young in 1911, and with him the romantic ideals sort of are a thing of the past.
Yes, true. And well, he had a really troubled life, which we're going to talk about, and today we're going to talk about his first symphony, I think. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Gustav Mahler, he was born on July 7th of 1860 in Kalište, Bohemia, of the Austrian Empire, and he died in May 18th in 1911, like Andrew just said, in Vienna. So he was an Austrian Jewish composer and conductor noted for his 10 symphonies and various songs with orchestra, which drew together many different strands of Romanticism. Although his music was largely ignored for 50 years after his death, Mahler was largely regarded as an important forerunner to 20th century techniques of composition and an acknowledged influence on such composers as Schoenberg, Shostakovich, and Britten.
Right. Mahler's life is one that's full of all kinds of... he has plenty of tragedy, plenty of difficulty, plenty of oppression. He's an Austrian Jew in a time in which it's not particularly a great time to be a Jew in Vienna. Mm-hmm. Those were very anti-Jewish times. Mm-hmm. But when Mahler was born, he was the son of an Austrian Jewish tavern keeper. He was in the booze industry, living in the Bohemian village of Kalište, as you mentioned earlier. In German, the word is Kalicht, in the southwestern corner of what is now the Czech Republic. You could easily say that he was a natural-born Czech citizen, though this is long before the Czech Republic ever existed, which I think the Czech Republic appeared about 20 years ago. Within months of his birth, the family moved to the nearby town of Wihlava, which in German is Iglau, where Mahler spent his childhood and his youth. These simple facts provide a first clue to his tormented personality. I mean, he had some tough times. He was afflicted by racial tensions from the beginning of his life. He was part of a German-speaking Austrian minority, and therefore he was sort of an outsider among the indigenous Czech population, and as a Jew, and who was sort of an outsider among the Austrian minority, he didn't have such a good time. Later in Germany, he was an outsider as both an Austrian from Bohemia and a Jew. So he was pretty much he was part of lots of sort of looked down upon groups at that time. He had an uphill battle.
Yeah, and then he's got problems with his wife later in life, and also with his daughter, of course. We're going to talk about that in a second. So Mahler's life was also complicated by the tension existing between his parents. His father, a self-educated man of fierce vitality, had married a delicate woman from a cultured family, and, coming to resent her social superiority, resorted to physically maltreating her. In consequence, Mahler was alienated from his father and had a strong mother fixation, which even manifested itself physically. A slight limp was unconsciously adopted in imitation of his mother's lameness. Furthermore, he inherited his mother's weak heart, which was to cause his death at the age of 50. And finally, there was a constant childhood background of illness and death among his 11 brothers and sisters.
unpleasant. So this unsettling early background might explain the nervous tension and the irony and the skepticism, the obsession with death that he always had. He wrote the Kindertotenlieder, the songs of the deaths of children, and a lot of his music is very dark and death-oriented. He was always sort of looking to discover some meaning in life. That was a lot of his life, was trying to figure that kind of stuff out. But it does not explain the prodigious energy, the intellectual power, the inflexibility of purpose, all of these things that carried him to the heights as both a master conductor and a composer. He was a person who was revered in his time by some and, of course, derided by others. The positive elements in his makeup stem no doubt from his father's side of the family, as did his physical vitality. Despite his inherited heart trouble, he was an extremely active man. He was not only a ruthless musical director, but also a tireless swimmer. He was a mountain walker. He experienced many things in his lifetime. He was out and about. I've been reading Alex Ross's The Rest is Noise right now. Fantastic book.
Yeah.
And it talks about him traveling to the United States and trying all kinds of new things like opium dens and seances and just strange things. But he's just a wonderfully curious man, but also a person with lots of physical vitality.
So his musical talent revealed itself early and significantly. Around the age of 4, fascinated by the military music at a nearby barracks and the folk music sung by Czech working people, he reproduced both on the accordion and on the piano and began composing pieces of his own. The military and popular styles, together with the sound of nature, became main sources of his mature inspiration. When he was 10, he made his debut as a pianist in Jihlava, and at 15 was so proficient musically that he was accepted as a pupil in the Vienna Conservatory. After winning piano and composition prizes and leaving with a diploma, he supported himself by sporadic teaching while trying to win recognition as a composer. When he failed to win the Conservatory's Beethoven Prize for composition with his first significant work, the cantata Das Klagende Lied, which is the song of complaint, which was completed in 1880, he turned to conducting for a more secure livelihood, reserving composition for the lengthy summer vacations.
Yeah, he was probably best known as a conductor more than probably any other thing. I mean, he was a wonderful, of course, composer to the people at the time, but people I think knew him more as a conductor. He was one of the people who really went into the foreground of mixing choreography with conducting, and he sort of went nuts. Built that expectation. So the next 17 years saw his ascent to the very top of his chosen profession. From conducting musical farces in Austria, he rose through various provincial opera houses, including important engagements at Budapest and Hamburg, to become artistic director of the Vienna Court Opera in 1897 at the age of 37. While people were telling him that he needed to do something to, he couldn't make the Vienna Court Opera his life's thing, but regardless, he kind of did. I mean, it was a huge deal. He built that opera he really made it grow. So as a conductor, he had won general acclaim, but as a composer, during his first creative period, the public did not quite understand his music that well. He confronted that lack of comprehension throughout a lot of his life, but it was particularly a problem in his earlier years.
Since Mahler's conducting life centered in the traditional manner on the opera house, it is at first surprising that his whole mature output was entirely symphonic. His 40 songs are not true lieder, but embryonic symphonic movements, some of which in fact provided a partial basis for the symphonies, but Mahler's unique aim, partially influenced by the school of Wagner and Liszt, was essentially autobiographical, the musical expression of a personal view of the world. And for this purpose, song and symphony were more appropriate than the dramatic medium of opera. Song because of its inherent personal lyricism, and symphony, from the Wagner and Liszt point of view, because of its subjective expressive power.
So let's talk a little bit about his musical works, the actual stuff he wrote. Now, he has 3 periods. In order to be a full bona fide composer, you have to have your 3 periods. So his first period, each of these 3 creative periods produces a symphonic trilogy. There's always some big three that happened. So in the first period, the three symphonies were conceived on a programmatic basis. That is, they were founded on a non-musical story or idea. The actual programs, which he later discarded, were concerned with establishing some ultimate ground for existence in a world dominated by pain, death, doubt, despair. To this end, he followed the example of Ludwig van Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral Symphony, and Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and building symphonies with more than just traditional four movements. He borrowed some of Wagner's music drama in expanding the time span, enlarging the orchestral resources, and indulging in uninhibited emotional expression. He drew a little bit from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in introducing texts sung by soloists and chorus, and he also borrowed a bit from Franz Schubert by introducing music from one of his own songs, settings of the poems of the German folk anthology Das Knaben Wunderhorn, the Youth's Magic Horn, or of poems by himself in a folk style. Mm-hmm. So he did a lot of, he drew from a lot of different inspirations to create his first three symphonies.
Yeah, and trying to expand always. So these procedures, together with Mahler's own tense and rhetorical style, vivid orchestration, and ironic use of popular style music, resulted in three symphonies of unprecedentedly wide contrast, but unified by his unmistakable creative personality and his firm command of symphonic structure. The program of the purely orchestral Symphony No. 1 in D major of 1888 is autobiographical of his youth. The joy of life becomes clouded over by an obsession with death in the macabre funeral march in the manner of Khaled, basically a parody of popular music, which we're going to talk about later, which is eventually rooted in the arduous and brilliant finale. The five-movement Symphony No. 2 of 1894, which has the popular title of Resurrection, begins with the death obsession, the first movement's funeral ceremony, and culminates in an affirmation of the Christian belief in immortality. A huge finale portraying the Day of Judgment and ending with the setting of the 18th century German writer Friedrich Klopstock's Resurrection Ode, involving soloists and choruses. The even vaster Symphony No. 3 in D major of 1896, also including a soloist and chorus, presents in six movements a Dionysiac vision of a great chain of being, moving from inanimate nature to human consciousness and the redeeming love of God.
Lots of extra musical ideas in there.
Exactly. All these themes that are present through his life, right? Trying to find meaning in life, but he's trying to depict all these things in his music.
Sure, yeah, the religious element in these works is pretty important. Mahler's disturbing early background, coupled with his lack of an inherited Jewish faith — his father was not necessarily a practicing Jew, he was sort of kind of an atheist — that resulted in a state of metaphysical torment. He had all these contradictions around him. He resolved them temporarily by identifying himself with Christianity. This was one of those genuine impulses, sure, but there was an element of expediency in his becoming baptized that sort of makes it seem as if it was something more than something that might have just been to help him secure that Vienna opera post in 1897. But the 10 years there represent his more balanced middle period. His newfound faith and his new high office brought a full and confident maturity, which was further stabilized by his marriage in 1902 to the inexorable Alma Maria Schindler, who bore him two daughters in 1902 and 1904. She was an interesting person. I'm sure we'll talk about him a little bit.
Yes,
I'll talk about her later.
Yeah. So now we move into the middle period. As a director of the Vienna Opera and for a time of the Vienna Philharmonic concerts, Mahler achieved an unprecedented standard of interpretation and performance, which proved an almost unapproachable model for those who followed him. Fanatical idealist, he drove himself and his artists with a ruthless energy that proved a continual inspiration, and with a complete disregard for personal considerations that won him many enemies who worked for his dismissal. At this time too, he made a number of tours and became famous over much of Europe as a conductor. He continued his recently acquired habit of devoting his summer vacations in the Austrian Alps to composing, and since in his case, this involved a ceaselessly expenditure of spiritual and nervous energy. He thereby placed an intolerable double strain on his frail constitution.
So, yeah, most of the works of his middle period reflect the fierce dynamism of his full maturity. An exception is Symphony Number 4, which is more of a pendant to the first period, conceived in 6 movements, 2 of which were eventually discarded. It has a Wunderhorn song finale for soprano, which was originally intended as a movement for Symphony Number 3, and which evokes a naive peasant conception of the Christian heaven. At the same time, in dispensing with an explicit program and a chorus and coming near to the normal orchestral symphony, it does foreshadow the middle period trilogy, numbers 5, 6, and 7. These are all purely orchestral. That is, there are no choirs or anything, no singers, with a new, hard-edged, contrapuntal clarity of instrumentation, and devoid of programs altogether. Yet each clearly embodies a spiritual conflict that reaches a conclusive resolution. Number 5, which is popularly called The Giant, written in 1902, and number 7, Song of the Night, was written in 1905. Both of these move from darkness to light. Through the light seems not to be the illumination of any afterlife, but the sheer exhilaration of life on earth. So say many people describing this kind of music. Both symphonies have 5 movements. Between them stands the work Mahler regards as his tragic symphony, the 4-movement number 6 in A minor, which moves out of darkness only with difficulty and then back into total night. It's sort of to imagine. I mean, these are all metaphors, obviously. I mean, these are just tones that we're describing as dark. But of course, we encourage you to listen to this music to get a real sense of what they mean by dark sounds. So from these 3 symphonies onward, he ceased to adapt his songs as whole sections or movements, but in each he introduced subtle allusions, either to his Wunderhorn songs or to his settings of poems by Friedrich Rückert, including the cycle Kinder Totenlieder, which I mentioned earlier, Songs and the Deaths of Children, which is not a very delightful work.
Yeah. So at the end of this period, he composed his monumental Symphony Number 8 in E-flat major in 1907 for 8 soloists, double choir, and orchestra, a work known as the Symphony of 1,000, owing to the large forces it requires, though Mahler gave it not such title. This stands apart as a later reversion to the expansive metaphysical tendencies of the first period, and represents consummation of them. In the first continuously choral and orchestral symphony ever composed, it could be called at once a massive statement of human aspirations and a cry for illumination from both the religious and humanistic points of view. The first of its 2 parts, equivalent to a symphonic first movement, is a setting of the medieval Catholic Pentecost hymn Veni Creator Spiritus, Part 2, amalgamating the 3 movement types of the traditional symphony, has to its text the mystical closing scene of J.W. von Goethe's Faust drama, the scene of Faust's redemption. The work marked the climax of Mahler's confident maturity, since what followed was disaster, of which he believed he had a premonition in composing his tragic Symphony Number 6. This work had revealed for the first time a superstitious element in his personality. The finale originally contained 3 climactic blows with a large hammer, representing the 3 blows of fate which fall on a hero, the last one felling him as a tree is felled. He subsequently removed the final blow from the score, and afterwards he identified this as foretelling the 3 blows that fell on himself in 1907, the last of which portend his own death. His resignation was demanded at the Vienna Opera. His 3-year-old daughter Maria died, and a doctor diagnosed his final heart disease.
Yeah, so the 3 blows that destroy the hero is a classic. I mean, that's one of Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist of the 20th century, talks about that as being a really important part of any hero's journey. Most mythology has that sort of connection to it. And you can even look at it as Jesus in the New Testament goes through 3 trials in the desert. And you see 3 trials, 3 blows all over the place. But yeah, and so that, I think that really that says something for Mahler's opinion of himself as a hero, someone trying to undergo some kind of magical transformation. But this brings us to his last period, the musical works of it. So this sort of begins around the age of 47 when he became a wanderer again. He was obliged to make a new reputation for himself as a conductor in the United States, directing performances at the Met and becoming a conductor of the Philharmonic Society of New York. He was in the United States for a little while, even though he did spend each summer back in the Austrian countryside to compose his last works. He returned finally to Vienna to die there in 1911, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. The three works constituting his last period trilogy, none of which he ever heard, are Das Lied von der Erde, The Songs of the Earth from 1908, also Symphony No. 9 from 1910, and Symphony No. 10 in F sharp major, left unfinished in the form of a comprehensive full-length sketch, though a full-length performing version has been made posthumously. The first of the three, again, revealed Mahler's superstition. Beginning as a song cycle to Chinese poems in German translations, it grew into a symphony for tenor, baritone, and orchestra. Yet, he would not call it a Symphony No. 9, believing, on the analogy of Beethoven and Bruckner, that a ninth symphony must be its composer's last. When he afterward began the actual 9, he said, half-jokingly, that the danger was over, since it was really the 10th, but in fact that symphony became that symphony became his last, and No. 10 remained in sketch form when he died.
Bless his heart. He tried to escape that 9 superstition, but the good news is he died after writing 9 symphonies. So, poor guy. I see. Self-fulfilling prophecy, maybe. So this last period trilogy marked an even more decisive break with the past than had the middle period trilogy. It represents a threefold attempt to come to terms with modern man's fundamental problem, that is, the reality of death, which in his case had effectively destroyed the religious faith he had opposed to death as an imagined event. Das Lied von der Erde, a 6-movement song cycle symphony, as opposed to the 2-part oratorio symphony No. 8, views the evanescence of all things human in veiled poetic terms, sardonic, wistful, and grief-stricken by turns, until it finds a sad consolation in the beauty of the earth that endures after the individual is no longer alive to see it, much like the Twilight Zone episode where the guy has full access to the library and no one to bother him except he just broke his glasses. One of those kinds of metaphors.
Mm-hmm. In the fourth movement, number 9, purely orchestral, the confrontation with death becomes an anguished personal one, evoking horror and bitterness in Mahler's most modern and prophetic movement, the Rondo Burlesque, and culminating in the finale of heartbroken resignation. The finales of both these works end with an extraordinary, long-drawn disintegration of the musical texture, suggesting dissolution. And the more extreme case in his Symphony No. 9 was for long thought to be Mahler's final comment on human existence. Growing familiarity with the sketch of No. 10 of his Symphony No. 10, however, has suggested that he broke through to a more positive attitude. Its 5 movements deal with the same conflicts as the 2 preceding works, but the resignation attained at the end of the finale is entirely serene and affirmative. So this is all things that we can extrapolate from listening to his music, because of course he was a romantic composer, so he put a lot of his own personality and emotions into his music, but of course this is all just trying to extrapolate from what he wrote.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit then about his reception, the way that his music was perceived by his public. So modern critical opinion recognizes Mahler's powerful influence during a period of musical transition. In his works may be found pervasive elements foreshadowing the radical methods employed by the 20th century, such elements as progressive tonality, which is ending a work in a different key than the initial one. He does do that. He follows the dissolution of tonality, obscuring the perception of key through the constant use of chromaticism, harmonies not belonging to the key. So he sort of foreshadows some of these 20th century methods. A breakaway from harmony produced by the entire orchestra in favor of a contrapuntal texture based on interwoven melodies. Fantastic method of writing, which goes back to the beginnings of polyphony. For groups of solo instruments within a full orchestra, the principle of continually varying themes rather than merely restating them. That's very romantic concept. That doesn't really happen so much in the classical era. Ironic quotation of popular styles and of sounds from everyday life, such as bird calls, bugle signals, freshak. And on the other hand, a new way of formally unifying the symphony through the adoption of techniques subtly derived from Liszt's cyclic method, carrying over of themes from one movement to a work of two others.
So, in terms of personal content of his art, it can be said that Mahler, more than any other composer, that he lived out the spiritual torment of this inherent modern man in his art.
That's quite true. So this brings us to the discussion of this particular podcast, which is his first symphony. Mahler's Symphony No. 1 in D major, which also is called the Titan Symphony, was primarily composed between January 20th and near the end of March in 1888. All this was in Leipzig, Germany. Although the work also incorporates pre-existing musical themes and ideas from earlier Mahler compositions. The first version of the work, which was titled in the concert program A Symphonic Poem in Two Sections, was premiered in 1889 at the Vigadó Concert Hall in Budapest, conducted by Mahler. The work was poorly received by the Budapest audience. Its second performance took place 3 years later in Hamburg after Mahler had made major revisions to the work. Mahler continued to revise the work up until the score was first published in 1899. A typical performance lasts around 55 minutes, making it one of Mahler's shortest symphonies, just 55 quick little minutes. So the symphony is a regular feature in concert programs around the world today.
Yeah, so that tells you the scope of Mahler, that 55 minutes, basically an hour, is his shortest symphony.
It's just a little bitty hour long.
Yeah. So Mahler's Symphony No. 1 was composed while he was working as second conductor at the Leipzig City Theater, where he worked from August of 1886 to May of 1888. Although there is conflict evidence regarding the period in which Mahler wrote his first symphony, the majority of resources suggest that he composed the bulk of the work in an intense creative burst between the 20th of January to the end of March of 1888, like you said before.
So this symphony incorporates plenty of earlier works. Mahler's early symphonies include things from that are not only written by himself but also other composers, which isn't really plagiarism, it's more just poetic quotation, that kind of thing. So the first symphony provides an extreme example of this, with music being either closely inspired by or extracted from such things as the Song of the Wayfarer, the Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen by Mahler, Mahler's Der Trompeter von Säckingen, the trumpeter from Säckingen, Mahler's Hans und Grete, which is Hansel and Gretel, Bruder Martin's Brother Martin, Bruder Martin, which is Brother Martin, Are You Sleeping? Folk song. Da 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 da. This is major in the original version. Liszt's Dante Symphony is quoted, and Wagner's Parsifal is alluded to. So Mahler once wrote to Natalie Bauer-Lechner, quote, "Composing is like playing with building blocks, where new buildings are created again and again using the same blocks. And indeed, these blocks have been there, ready to be used since childhood, the only time that is designated for gathering." So, I mean, what he's describing here is the composer as compiler, which, I mean, that's what composing is, right? Is creating something out of parts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I get that.
Yeah.
So Mahler conducted the premiere of his first symphony with the Budapest Philharmonic Orchestra in the Vigadó Concert Hall on Wednesday, November 20 of 1889, 18 months after the work's completion. The premiere didn't go greatly. It wasn't such a great thing. So Mahler had presented the audience with a programmatic symphonic poem, yet no explanatory program notes or descriptive titles were provided to assist the listener's interpretation of what the music was supposed to portray. So this caused a lot of confusion and caused a lot of annoyance among the audience, who were particularly bewildered by the extreme and dramatic change of mood established by the funeral march.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, by the way, I got a lot of these resources that we're working on today. I got it from GustavMahler.com, where you can see you can read a lot about all of his symphonies. So. Following the symphony's failure at the Budapest premiere, the work was left untouched for 3 years. Mahler began making revisions to the symphony in Hamburg between January and August of 1893, where he conducted this version for the symphony on Friday, October 27th of 1893. This performance proved an overall success, receiving largely positive reviews from the critics.
Then Mahler made further changes to the program notes for a performance at the Saxon Court in Weimar, and as a part of a music festival organized by Richard Strauss. The performance received a mixed reaction, as evidenced by a letter from Mahler to a friend. Quote, "My symphony was received with furious opposition by some and with wholehearted approval by others. The opinions clashed in an amusing way in the streets and in the salons."
So Mahler conducted a fourth performance of the symphony in March 16th of 1896 in Berlin, along with the removal of the second blooming movement. Mahler discarded all programmatic aspects of the work, instead opting to present it as absolute music, with the simple title Symphony in D major.
So the first three performances of Mahler's Symphony No. 1 contained a serenade-like second movement, which was titled Andante or Blumina. This movement received harsh criticism and was later removed from the work by Mahler after its third performance in Weimar, also being omitted from the first publication in 1899. Mahler's first symphony has been played as a work of four movements since the symphony's fourth performance at the Berlin premiere, which took place March 16, 1896.
All right. So the first three performances of Mahler's first symphony were presented as a work of program music. Program music was first introduced by Hungarian composer Franz Liszt, describing music that aims to tell a story, illustrate literary ideas, or evoke pictorial scenes. And we've talked about this before, especially with Berlioz's Fantastic. So Mahler described the work as a symphonic poem for the premiere performance, Titan, a tone poem in symphonic form for the second, and more simply as a symphony with the traditional title of Titan for the third performance. From the fourth performance onwards, Mahler dropped all program notes, describing the work simply Symphony in D major. But people still refer actually to the symphony as Titan.
Yeah, Mahler chose the title Titan as a reference to Jean Paul's great novel of the same name, Titan. Titan was included in the title of the symphony's second and third performances in Hamburg and Weimar, respectively, after which it was permanently removed. How significantly the relationship between the program, Jean Paul, and specifically his novel Titan remains a question open to debate. There is, however, no doubt that Mahler was a great admirer of Jean Paul's works. Literary references can be found between the program notes and Jean Paul's novels. Jean Paul.
So the Hunter's Funeral Procession title, Gestrandet, which is Totensch in Kalot's Manier. I don't know how to say that.
Gestrandet! Totenmarsch in Kalot's Manier.
Gestrandet, Totenmarsch in Kalot's Manier, which was the third movement of the Weimar version, refers to an old folk song that was well known among Austrian children in Mahler's time. The story's narrative is told through the eyes of forest animals, written in a jocular character. It tells of the burial of a hunter whose funeral procession is composed not of humans but wild animals, including bear, foxes, hares, a wolf, cranes, and partridges. Songs of birds. So the animals seem to derive great joy from the occasion, with rabbits leading the procession, holding banners, and music being sung by all the animals, accompanied by the musical cats and a group of bohemian musicians.
Naturally, I mean, you got to throw some bohemians in with the animals, right? That's horrible. That's terrible. So so there was a removal. So a direct explanation for the removal of the program notes is given by Mahler in the letter he wrote to Max Marschalk in 1896. He says, "Originally my friends persuaded me to supply a kind of program in order to facilitate the understanding of the D major symphony. Thus I had subsequently invented this title and explanations that I omitted them in this time cost, not only by the fact that I considered them inadequate, but also because I found out how the public has been misled by them." Unquote. So the final four movement structure without the program consists of four very non-programmatic titles. Langsam schleppend, slowly dragging. Immer sehr gemächlich, very restrained throughout. Kräftig bewegt, doch nicht zu schnell. This is number 2, moving strongly but not too quickly. Recht gemächlich, restrained, a trio, a Ländler. Mahler just goes on and on. Number 3, movement 3, is feierlich und gemessen, ohne zu schleppen, solemnly and measured, without dragging. Sehr einfach und schlicht wie eine Volksweise. Very simple, like a folk tune. And wieder etwas bewegter wie im Anfang, something stronger as at the start. A funeral march based on the children's song Frère Jacques, or Bruder Martin. Sturm ist bewegt, energisch, is the fourth movement, which just means stormily agitated and energetic. So these no longer have any, these have no kind of programmatic names. They're simply describing the music itself, describing what the conductor's supposed to do. So Mahler finally decided upon the above titles, by the aforesaid titles, for the symphony's publication in 1899.
Yeah, and that's one thing about Mahler is that he is very specific about everything in his music. You know, about specific tempos, a specific character, specific dynamics. Everything is like very, very clearly notated. And I mean, when you look at a Mahler score, Mahler score, you see almost every measure. You see some kind of indication telling you what to do pretty much every time, and that also tells you that he was a conductor, right? So he's trying to portray, to let every conductor know exactly how he wants his music to be. There's really not a lot of room for interpretation in his music.
Right.
So in terms of musical structure, the published version of Mahler's first symphony consists of a 4-movement symphonic structure. The first movement is in modified sonata form. The second is a scherzo and trio based on a Ländler, which is a folk dance in 3/4 time. The third is a slow funeral march, and the fourth serves as an expansive finale incorporating material from previous movements. Traditionally, the second movement should be the slow movement followed by the minuet and trio. Mahler reversed this order for his first symphony. The additional blooming movement was originally the second movement before his removal, which you said before, and the keys of the movements are as follow: D major for the first, A major for the second, D minor for the third, F minor for the last, with a grand finale ending in D major.
So in a series of conversations Mahler had with Bauer Lechnes, he perceives each of the first 4 movements, the Blumina version, as landmarks in the life of the symphony's hero. Quote, in the first movement we are carried away by a Dionysian, jubilant mood that has not yet been broken or dulled by anything, unquote. The Blumen movement was described as a love episode. The scherzo, the young lad still roaming around the world, is much stronger, rougher, and more fit for life, unquote. And the funeral march, quote, now he, my hero, has found a hair in his soup and his meal is spoiled, unquote. Mahler described the finale to Bernhard Schuster as quote, the sudden outburst of despair of a deeply wounded and broken heart, unquote.
Mm-hmm. So the first movement is in modified sonata form, like we said before, in 4/4 time throughout. It begins with a slow introduction representing the gradual awakening of nature from a long winter sleep. And this comes from his program, from his Hamburg program. So basically what he's doing is he is alternating between tempo primo, between the first tempo that you hear, and some other kind of theme or melody. Right. So the tempo of the introduction section alternates between langsam schleppend, which is slowly and dragging, which depicts nature's slumber, and then you have the più mosso sections, which have more kind of movement, which is a little faster, and this is the awakening calls of fanfares on clarinets and trumpets.
So there's not one tempo, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So just there you can see that it's almost like every 2 measures, every 3 measures, there's something happening, and everything is very clearly notated by Mahler.
It's where we get, there's a lot of our conception of music from around that time is that music does not hold very strong to a single tempo, it's constantly changing. Mm-hmm. So the strings hold the A, so they hold a note, A, spread over the range of 7 octaves. The violins use harmonics for the highest registers. A 2-note motif is gradually developed in the woodwinds, establishing the following repeated pattern of descending fourths, reminiscent of the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in D minor. And those are just fourths that are, just has this very pleasant sound to it.
Mm-hmm. And you can probably hear it now, and you can see it in your screen. So, This nature's theme is interrupted by a fanfare, which is the awakening call that we talked about before, played by the clarinets, and later by muted offstage trumpets, indicated in the score in Zweite Entfernung aufgestellt. Whew.
In sehr weite Entfernung aufgestellt.
Thank you, which means at a very far distance. So already there you can see something that's really cool that Mahler does in a lot of his symphonies, that he has offstage bands, offstage trumpets, offstage brass. He always does that in a lot of his symphonies. And in this case, it's just trying to let you know that it's at a very, very far distance.
And then a slow and mellow melody is later introduced in the horns, with directions to be sung very softly.
All right. And after more introductions by the trumpets playing the fanfare theme, a rising chromatic motif is played by the double bass and cellos, with the mature theme layered on top by the trumpets.
So the ending of the introduction leads seamlessly into the exposition through the gradual build-up of the descending two-note cuckoo motive, which transforms itself into the main theme of the first movement, marking the beginning of the exposition.
So we move to the exposition, and the exposition basically just has 4 main parts, which is measure 62 through 74, which is the song theme, then 75 through 108, which is music from the third verse of the second song from Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, and then and measures 109 through 135 is music from the first verse of second song from the same song, but this time is the first verse instead of the third, and then measures 136 to 162 is the final group taken from the trilly motif, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The exposition breaks free from the tense atmosphere established in the introduction section, becoming carefree and light. The main theme takes its melody from the second song from Mahler's Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, which was titled Ging du heut, Morgen übers Feld, and and the song's lyrics, isn't it becoming a fine world, chirp chirp, fair and sharp, how the world delights me. So that's the lyrics of the song, and it's translated beautifully both musically and semantically into the symphony. Pum, 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 pum. Yeah.
So this melody first appears in the cellos and gradually builds in dynamics, builds in volume as it makes its way through the different sections of the orchestra, eventually being played by the entire brass section. A new bird call is introduced toward the end of the exposition, which is called the Tirili motive.
And that's the pa-da-da-da-dum, pa-da-da-da-dum. Okay, so the exposition is repeated as it would have been, normal in that era, and that also gives you the sense that the cycle is being repeated. This cycle of nature is repeated, and then comes the development. So this development section begins as a new form of the introduction, keeping the drone A and cuckoo calls. The clarinet and trumpet fanfare motif is, however, suppressed until later in the section. The opening also incorporates the newly introduced Tirili motif, which is, and also a cantabile cello theme is introduced, which functions as a secondary theme.
The song motif is developed through variations in color, dynamic, and orchestration. The Inferno section from the finale is also hinted upon in this section, creating a terrifying darkness. It directly contrasts against the joyous breakthrough climax that immediately follows that.
Alright, so we move into the second movement, which is a modified minuet and trio. The minuet is replaced by the Landler, which is a 3/4 folk dance originated from Landler, Austria. And August Beer described the movement as transporting the listener to the village pub. It has the title Scherzo, but it is an honest-to-goodness peasant dance. The piece is full of healthy realism taken from everyday life, with purring, buzzing basses, shrieking violins, and squeaking clarinets, to which the peasants dance their stomper. End quote.
The movement is divided into two parts, the opening main section and the trio. The main movement begins as a ventler, changing into a waltz. The trio section is a mixture of slow ventler and pops. So here we have two main sections. One is 174 measures long, the opening main section, which is a pleasant speed. And then the other section is the trio. So the movement opens with the following motif played by the bass. Boom, 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 boom. Can't miss it.
And
Simply adorable.
Yep. And the Landler's main theme is then introduced in the woodwinds over the top of the bass motif. Bum, bum, ba, bum, 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 ba, 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 bum. And this theme is repeated throughout the Landler, being shared through the different sections of the orchestra. Mahler develops and builds upon the theme leading up to the Landler's energetic finish. Similarities can be found between Mahler's early lead, Hans und Grete, written in 1880, and the rhythms and turns found in the main movement. The following ostinato rhythms and motifs from the form the basis of much of the movement. So basically, there are like three main things that are happening here throughout this movement, which are the pa ta 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 ta, like it was the same rhythm that you just sang, and then you have ta 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 ta, which you can hear a lot in the violins, and then you can also hear this motif, which you hear a lot throughout the woodwind, especially the oboes, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the trio section takes the form of a slow waltz, providing a contrasting character to the main section of the movement. A modified version of the Ländler returns at the end of the trio section in a shorter, more heavily orchestrated form. The broad harmonic area covered, especially in the middle section of the main Ländler movement, in addition to the dissonant harmony and unrefined musical gestures used by Mahler, all help achieve the unsophisticated peasant-like character of the movement. Just a good, it's sort of the tonal answer, tonal pre-answer to Rite of Spring, right?
Yes.
It's a nice, pleasant peasant-like character.
Yeah. So
instead of killing a virgin.
That's right. So the third movement, which is also this funeral march that we've been talking about, which is the funeral march in Calais manner. This third movement acts as the slow movement of the symphony's four-movement structure. The extra musical idea inspiring the movement is taken from the Hunter's Funeral, which is an old Austrian folk story which we talked about before.
Yeah, Mahler described the movement in a conversation with Bauer Lechner in 1900, saying, quote, "On the surface one might imagine this scenario. A funeral procession passes by our hero, and the misery, the whole distress of the world, with its cutting contrasts and horrible irony, grasps him. The funeral march of Brother Martin, one has to imagine as being played in a dull manner by a band of very bad musicians, as they usually follow such funeral processions. The roughness, gaiety, and banality of this world then appears in the sound of some interfering bohemian musicians, heard at the same time as the terrible, painful lamentation of the hero. It has a shocking effect in its sharp irony and an inconsiderate polyphony, especially when we see the procession returning from the funeral after the beautiful middle section, and the funeral band starts to play the usual happy tune, which pierces here to the bone," unquote. So in 1901, Mahler wrote in a letter to Bernard Schuster, quote, "The third movement is heart-rending, tragic irony and is to be understood as an exposition and preparation for the sudden outburst in the final movement of despair of a deeply wounded and broken heart," unquote.
So this movement begins with the timpani softly beating a two-note ostinato in isolation. And then Mahler gives directions in the score, quote, "solemn and measured without dragging," unquote. After two bars, the main melodic theme forming the basis of the movement is introduced on a solo contrabass, which was a very innovative role for the instrument. I mean, how many times do you hear a solo bass in an orchestra. You don't hear that very often.
So Mahler reproduced this melody note for note from the popular round Bruder Martin, or Brother Martin, which is also known in French as Frère Jacques. Are You Sleeping, Brother John in English. Described by August Beer as a humorous round sung in Germany by male choirs and young men in pubs in a jocular chanting manner, quote unquote. The canon section, which is bars 1 to 38, slowly builds momentum as the round is picked up by different instruments in a highly unusual order, jumping from different sections of the orchestra, resulting in timbre combinations that are characteristically Mahler. So we have a double bass solo, then muted cellos, then bass tuba, as opposed to a soprano tuba. First bassoon and first clarinet. We have muted violas, and then after that the first horn plays it, then 4 flutes, then the English horn, 2 clarinets, and the bass clarinet, followed by violas and cellos 1 octave apart, followed by 4 muted horns and harp. So, so Mahler here is taking this really familiar tune and letting people come in a very unusual collection of instruments.
Record on my phone now. All right. It's not a symphonic podcast without some kind of, technical problem.
Yes, son.
All right. So, in a conversation with Natalie Bauer-Lechner, Mahler stated, quote, "In the round, the new entrance always is distinct in a surprising timbre, drawing attention to itself," unquote. The oboe introduces the following counter melody in bar 19, which is heard again in bar 29 with the addition of the E-flat clarinet, the first appearance of the instrument in the symphony.
So cute.
Yep.
So Mahler then introduces a new section lasting from bar 39 to 44. The oboe is given a swaying melody in thirds and sixths, with the trumpets providing a counter melody underneath. This counter melody continues into the parody section, acting as a bridge between the contrasting Bruder Martin opening and the parody section, which follows.
Mm-hmm. All right. The unexpected parody sections, which is bars 45 to 49 and then 57 through 60, includes the following novel instrumentation resembling a Kessler band of Turkish cymbals, bass drums, oboes, clarinets, flutes, and a trumpet duo with the string giving the unsophisticated accompaniment. Mahler hints at a return to the canon in bars 72 through 81, but instead establishes a third, more reflective section in bars 81 through 112, which uses material found in the final stanza of the fourth song from the leader Eines Fahrender Gesellen, which is
Die zwei blauen Augen von meinem Schatz.
That's it, which is the 2 blue eyes of my beloved. And then a return to the canon is made in bar 113, this time played in E-flat minor as opposed to D minor, as it is found in the beginning. It modulates back to the distant key of D minor in measure 139.
Mahler's impressive contrapuntal technique is exhibited in the penultimate section of the movement when he interweaves 3 previously introduced thematic elements simultaneously on top of each other, with the direction plötzlich viel schneller, suddenly much faster. The despairing canon, Bruder Martin, is set against the cheerful parody melody, demonstrating the painful coexistence of tragedy and triviality in life, a theme Mahler would continue to explore in his later works. The intertwining elements gradually unravel and the movement comes to a slow conclusion with alternating fourths, the unifying motive underlying the symphony played in the lower strings.
Mm-hmm. The slow movement of Mahler's first symphony skillfully switches from one extreme mood to another without giving the impression of a break. Mahler wrote of the movement's ambivalent nature, quote, as an expression of a sometimes ironic and happy and sometimes eerie and brooding mood, unquote. The novel instrumentation, impressive counterpoint, construction of the climax, all exemplify Mahler's ingenuity and technical prowess.
So this brings us to the fourth movement, Dall'inferno al Paradiso, from the Inferno to Paradiso. Although Mahler does not use the traditional sonata allegro form for the final movement of the symphony, it is possible to analyze the movement as such, being divided into 3 sections: exposition, development, and recapitulation. Material from previous movements are revisited with additional motifs inspired by Liszt and Wagner included. The programmatic title for the movement, From Inferno to Paradise, is clearly depicted in the music. Mahler uses the key of F minor to symbolize the Inferno, contrasted against the distant key of D major, representing paradise. That's sort of a third relation. One of those Russian-y sounding things that go down. Yeah, it's quite a distant jump between those two keys.
Yeah. So Konstantin Floros wrote, quote, "The dynamics of the movement represent the repeated efforts to overcome the level of the Inferno and to arrive in the sphere of the Paradiso," unquote. In a conversation with Boer Lechner in November of 1900, Mahler explained, quote, "The last movement, which follows the preceding one without a break, begins with a horrible outcry. Our hero is completely abandoned, engaged in a most dreadful battle with all the sorrows of this world. Time and again, he and the victorious motive with him is dealt a blow by fate whenever he rises above it and seems to get hold of it. And only in death, when he has become victorious over himself, does he gain victory. Then the wonderful allusion to his youth rings out once again with the theme of the first movement, which is this glorious victory chorale," unquote.
So the final movement continues directly on from the previous movement without interruption. An abrupt cymbal crash opens the movement, which is immediately followed by a strikingly dissonant chord produced by the woodwind, strings, and brass sections, reinforced by a bass drum hit. This ferocious opening allows for the this ferocious opening alludes to the Inferno, creating a tremendous contrast to the faint, distant ending of the previous movement. Mahler described this opening as, quote, "the sudden outburst of despair of a deeply wounded and broken heart," unquote, as we've said a few times now. Some of the key motifs representing the Inferno were borrowed from Liszt's Dante Symphony in 1856. Wonderful decade. He's a transcendentalist in the United States. A work Mahler would have assumed familiar with his audience. For example, the cross motif, which appears in bars 6 to 8, was taken from Liszt's Symphony.
Yeah. Ba-bum, bum, bum. Yep. So this oral this oral symbol of the cross, originating from the old Gregorian music, is found in two forms in the movement. The cross symbol is used by Mahler as a device to break through from the world of the Inferno to the realm of the Paradise. The symbol of the cross only ever appears in the minor version when the music is in the world of the Inferno. First, in the minor version, there is an intervals of a minor second and a major third, which create this cross, and then in the major version, the intervals of a major second and a minor third create the cross. The chromatically descending triplet motif is first heard in bars 8 through 18, which are also called these Inferno triplets, and this was another motif taken from Liszt's Symphony. Ta-da-da-dum, ta-da-da-dum. Yep.
So after the introduction section, the following theme in F minor is presented boldly in the brass and woodwinds. If I could sight read, I just fly out there. Okay. So this theme is expanded and developed, gaining momentum until it transforms into the swelling brass section, followed by a brief mellow transition section, which leads into the beautifully lyrical secondary section in D flat major.
Yep. Okay. And the exposition's concluding section, bars 238 to 253, recalls the slow introduction from the main section beginning in measure 55, along with the Inferno triplet motif.
The development section begins with another Inferno motif taken from Liszt's Dante Symphony, played by the horns, clarinets, and oboe in G minor.
And the victorious motif in C major begins in bar 290, with the cross motif making its first appearance in its major form, played pianissimo by the first trumpet in bar 296. This section includes a secondary motif forming the following theme, which you can hear now. Bum, 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 bum.
The above theme is a rhythmic variation of the Grail theme from Richard Wagner's Parsifal opera, crafted in a manner which enables Liszt's cross symbol to be combined with the Dresden Amen sequence used in Wagner's Parsifal.
The second section of the development in C minor begins in measures 317, and the victorious theme makes its second appearance in measures 370 through 375. However, this time the dynamic markings are pesante and fortissimo, which were previously pianissimo, and this victory is seemingly in reach of the hero. the section begins in C major, modulating to D major, which is the realm of the parallax.
Mahler elaborated on this victorious section to Bauer Lechner. During 1893, he wrote, quote, "Maybe this was even more obvious in my first symphony at a transition that gave me so much trouble. There the concern was to gain a triumphant lasting victory after the music, having expressed short rays of hope, would always fall back into deepest despair. After a long search, it became obvious to me that I had to modulate from one key to the next higher one, from C major to D major, the tonic of the piece. One could have accomplished this easily by using the half step in between, moving up from C to C sharp and then to D, but everyone would have known it to be the next step. Instead, my D chord had to sound as if it had fallen from heaven, as if it had come from another world. Thus I found the transition by way of a very free and bold modulation, if I do say so myself, that for the longest time I did not want to use. And if there is anything great about the whole symphony, then it is this passage, which I am convinced has no equal." We know that Mahler was a humble man.
Yeah. So the chorale theme in D major contains a modified version of the nature's theme from the first movement. The first movement, in the first movement, it appears in measures 18 to 21, which are these fourths, right? And then in the final movement, it appears in measures 388 through 391, which are this kind of fourth, descending fourth.
Sort of a pachable canon kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Da, 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 da. Yeah.
A slow section concludes the development section. Many motifs and themes from the first movement return as the hero remembers his carefree youth. The nature theme, the fanfare awakenings, bird calls, as quail call, cuckoo call, and the Tyrrelly motive, the chromatic bass step motif, etc. These previous musical ideas are intertwined with newly introduced materials such as the Inferno triplets. So, yeah, it's a lot. And then after that, it's a recap, which luckily doesn't require so many words to describe because, it's a recap. So this includes a secondary section with the transition in F major, followed by a main theme in F minor at the original tempo. The Inferno image now has been moved to a distance, so it's very quiet. Intensification of material from the main section is the next section from that, and then the final section before the coda is Höchste Kraft, utmost strength. Breakthrough, third occurrence of the victorious motif and chorale theme in D major, Paradiso. Following that is the coda, measures 696 through 731, which really isn't that many measures, if you think.
Yes, that's true. So, in the recap section, the hero has clearly left the world of the Inferno, with its motif being performed in triple piano far behind him. The symphony reaches its climax in the breakthrough section, which is measures 623, where the victorious motif returns for the third and final time, along with the triumphant chorale in D major and earlier triplet fanfare material. And that is Symphony number 1.
Yay! So that gives you a pretty good idea of just how complicated these little things are to describe. I mean, people love to just sit and listen to it without knowing what's going on, but of course there are always a lot of people who like to try to create as vivid of a program as they can for this stuff. And of course Mahler does help along that path as well with lots of information about what he thinks the music's about. But yeah, I mean, it takes a lot to describe this stuff. These are very large works, and this is just the first symphony. It's the shortest one, at only 55 minutes in length.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it is Mahler, and I knew that this podcast was going to be long today because it's Mahler, so we had to put some time into him.
Under Mahlerian logic, we would have both died after our 9th episode. But.
That's true, actually. Yep. All right, so we've done Mahler, and like I said before, Mahler is one of those big composers, right? And of course, being one of my favorite composers, it's daunting to talk about these huge composers. All right, so we've done Mahler now, Andrew.
Yay!
All right. So anything else you want to say about this?
That's all I got.
All right, well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Symphonic Podcast. As always, you can email us at symphonicpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions or concerns. You can find us, of course, on iTunes or on YouTube with the video annotations and all that fun stuff. All right, then until next time, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.